All right. Well, I want to say thank you for inviting me to speak. I want to give you a little short background about myself and about the organization that I represent. My name is Lynn Burns, and I did 20 years in the Air Force as a computer operator, was what the title started out as, which was almost 35 years ago now. And then as I worked through the 20 years, I became a network installer, and I was installing TSSCI systems at contractor locations. And so I got to where I had to be knowledgeable of both the contractor side of security and the Air Force's side of security to make sure that we can meet both those responsibilities. When I finished my time in the Air Force, I retired and I got hired as a contractor, not to be a network guy, but to be their security guy and to introduce or to train people on the requirements of protecting classified information. So I did security clearance processing for people as well to make sure they renewed their clearance every 5 years, but also train them on how to store classified, how to mark classified, standard security manager type of duties. As time went on, classified systems became more prevalent in contractor organizations that were not government owned, but they were contractor owned and contractor managed. And there wasn't a good process for training people on how to manage those systems and what type of security was required for protecting the data on those classified networks. And I got out of the Air Force in 2003. So we're talking somewhere in the last 17 years between 2003 and now. And in that 17 years, the requirements for security of classified contractor networks has really had a steep incline in what's required and what has to be done for it. The organization I represent is NCMS, and NCMS is a nonprofit organization that trains security managers on how to train on security requirements. So we make sure that the security managers know what the government is looking for, what type of precautions they have to inform their employees about, about counterintelligence, about personnel security, about cyber security, and we make sure that the security managers have the knowledge they need in order to meet the government requirements. And my role, I'm the vice president of the organization. I took on that role about a year ago, but I'm also their cyber guy. I work with the on the contractor side of terminology. An ISSM is your information system security manager, and that's kind of the highest level in the contractor organization of cyber manager. So I work with cyber managers around the country to make sure that they're meeting the government expectations on their classified systems and that they are trained on how to do that. So I lead a forum that has about 600 members in it, and there's probably 500 companies represented in that membership, and we communicate daily about different requirements and how you implement things and what tools work best for auditing or what tools work best, for making sure your network, your operating system updates are installed. It's a constant flow of communication, and that's kind of where I leave that. So my presentation today that I want to go over Jesse, I'm looking how to move my slide forward. I think I found it. All right, we're working. Okay, so this presentation is, I couldn't tailor it specific to DoD, so I'm hoping you guys can translate with me, and I'll try to talk through that. For contractors, our equivalent of, you get your guidance from the Air Force, and the Air Force gets it from the DoD. For contractors, we get our guidance from an organization called DCSA, which is the Defense Counterintelligence Security Agency. and they have oversight over probably 80% of the contractor classified networks. But they're the equivalent of your DoD in the policy realm for contractors. We don't actually use DoD policies. We look at them, we reference them, but our guidance comes from DCSA. So even if we tell DCSA, DoD doesn't do it that way, they shake their head and say, we don't care. We make the rules for contractors and you follow our rules. So every time I say DCSA today, in your realm, kind of picture DoD. And there will be some differences, and I'm hoping you guys can help sort those out. But I'm going to reference a lot of NIST 853 type of controls. And those controls are the same for everybody. How the DoD implements them or how the Air Force chooses to implement the DoD guidance might be different on a specific control. And same thing on how DCSA implements it. DCSA may tell contractors we have to do something different, or they interpret the control a little differently than how the DoD does. And I'm sorry I couldn't flip them all over to DoD specific, but we'll go through here and talk about it. This is going to move pretty fast. I have a lot of slides here, and I talk quickly to make sure I hit the timelines on them. But so the overview of this presentation is what security training do you as a security manager are you required to teach your users of your classified network? If you're a user of a classified network and you're not a security manager, this is going to give you some insights into the security training you're supposed to be getting as a user of a classified network. And that's whether you're DoD or contractor or not. This training is required by the NIST 853 controls. And since you're implementing those controls on your DoD networks, you should still be getting this training. So we're going to start running through here. Quick caveat, there are lots of dots in the slides. That means I deleted content to make it fit on the screen. So if you're really interested in that particular control, go read the full wording of the control. Don't take my abbreviated interpretation of it. So quick overview, I'm going to run through who the trainer is. I'm going to talk about security training records, which is control AT4 covers that. The NISPOM is kind of the contractor equivalent of DoD 8570. It has really brief information about the administrative requirements for running cybersecurity, not the details of how you administrate a system, but the rules that govern the overarching requirements. So I touched on that briefly, and some of the training requirements that has. It's specific to contractors, but you'll see that there is overlap where you might say, oh, well, that's the NISPOM rule, but we have a different rule that falls out of, Air Force policy or Air Force guidance. And then the DAPM. So the Defense Counterintelligence Security Agency, DCSA, put together an authorization process manual. And the acronym for that is the DAPM. And that is the contractor version of NIST 853. So if you have an Air Force specific or DoD interpretation of those NIST 853 controls, this is the kind of the contract version. There are places in the NIST 853 controls where the control says, and one specific one says, training records will be retained for, and then in the NIST 853, it's got kind of a blank that says agency requirements placed here. So you have to have a DoD interpretation of that control to tell you have to keep training records for a year or you have to keep training records for 5 years. So whether the DoD puts out that version of it or whether the Air Force puts out that version of it, you're going to have their interpretation of the control in order to finish out that requirement to tell you what it is. And so on this presentation, I'm going to make references to the DAPM, and that's just the contractor version telling us what we have to do there. And then we're going to run through a lot of the controls that require training to be accomplished. All right, so who's supposed to be the trainer? A lot of contractors think I'm not the the ISMs think I'm not the trainer. We have a training guy. He does the training. DAPM 3.6, which is our interpretation, our overarching policy, says that the ISM is primarily responsible for maintaining the overall security program of the systems within their organization, and are accountable for the implementation of the RMF, for developing and implementing an effective IS security education and a training awareness program. So it's the information security manager's job to create that security program. And then the list of requirements for those ISMs is huge. So we went from item D down to item EE on the list of requirements in the guidance. And that is that they're responsible for briefing users on their responsibility with regard to IS security, restrictions, and safeguards before they are allowed on the IS, and ensuring that the ISOs receive the necessary technical training to carry out those duties. For our purposes, an ISO is the person who does the daily activities of monitoring, of doing your audits and ensuring that your operating systems are updated, and then the ISSM is the manager of that. I know in the SCI environment, ISOs are the actual manager level, and ISM is something else. So the acronyms are a little bit shaky, but I'm hoping you guys will translate along with me. Okay, so in the contractor version of 800 or DoD 8570, our guidance says that the ISM briefs users on their responsibilities with regard to the IS security and verifies contractor personnel are trained on the IS's prescribed security restrictions and safeguards before they're allowed on the system. So again, it's just emphasizing that the ISSM, or the security manager of the system, is the one responsible to train people on the requirements of that system. So we're going to come back to this slide several times, and it just kind of lines off the topics as we move through so you guys can see where we're at. I tried several different ways to put this PowerPoint together, and this is the best way I came up with, but it's still, it's a complicated subject. The training requirements for classified systems that are in the RMF 853 requirements, it's complicated. So training records, this was the example I was talking about before. Control AT4 talks specifically about security training records, and it says the documents and monitors individuals' information system security training activities, including basic security awareness and training, specific information systems and training, and retains individual training records for a minimum of 5 years. That's the DAPM interpretation of that rule, but in the 853, that last 3 words is blank, and it has your agency would fill that in, so you get a DoD requirement in there or an Air Force requirement. But 5 years is a long time to keep training records. People transfer in, they transfer out. You have users that are only on the network for a few weeks, and then they're off the network. But you've got to keep those training records for 5 years to show that each of those people progressed through the training they were responsible to do. Then DCSA wrote a supplement to that, and their supplement says what's supposed to be in that training record, that the training can't just say Lynn Burns did his annual user training. It's got to have the name of the training, the date of the training, the type of training, whether it was a PowerPoint or whether it was a one-on-one briefing, and then the initial training has to also include signatures. You can't just have somebody click through a PowerPoint and then send an email back that says, I completed this training. They actually have to sign a form for the initial training. So it makes that record-keeping process more complicated. And then it actually specifies that you have to keep training records. I don't know why it had to be a separate statement from the overall control, but they actually put a statement in there saying that you have to keep the training records. All right, so this is back to as we're moving down through our agenda. So like I said, the NISPOM is our administrative guidance, and it does require initial security briefings, and generally, though, this guidance is written for not cyber security managers, but just general security managers that do your security clearances and your security training. So it lists their requirements that they're required to brief people on, and then items E and F say, but the initial and annual refresher cyber awareness training is required for all IS users. So even for the security managers, it's requiring them to make sure that the people who are accessing the classified systems are doing their training, and that that training is relevant to the roles and responsibility of that employee. So we're going to look at each of those E and F a little closer here. So under E, that correlates with control AT2, which is security awareness training. And AT2 says that the organization provides basic training and that you do that training in 3 different circumstances. You do it initially when somebody first gets on the network. You do it when there's a change, something has changed. Either they've gone from being a standard user to being a privileged user, so you have to give them training again, and then you do that training annually as well. So there's 3 different cases you have to check the box for to say, yes, we're providing that training initially, we're providing it annually, and if something changes either on the network or in the person's roles, we're providing that training at that time as well. So DCSA supplemented that control, and they put requirements in for contractors that kind of re-emphasize that you have to do initial, you have to do annual, and you have to do change condition training. And then they talk about that the annual training doesn't have to be specific. You don't have to do the same PowerPoint that you did initially. You can do annual training in various ways by doing it at staff meetings or doing online meetings, very similar to what you're doing this weekend. We'll check the box for being an annual training. All right, so now we're going to look at item F, where it talks about security procedures that are specific to the employee's role. And in our guidance, when you look at that, it steps away from the security manager personnel type of security training and specifically calls out that cyber training will follow the controls under those requirements. So then when you jump to those requirements, it says that, all IS users will comply with the ISSM security program requirements as part of the responsibility for protection of IS. Be accountable for their actions, not share their passwords. So this is specific topics that are supposed to be in your training. And then number 4 there is one that a lot of people struggle with. Protect authentication mechanisms at the classification level to which the mechanism permits access. So if you create a classified CD and you encrypt it, you have to treat the password for that CD at the same level as the information on the CD. And that needs to be in everybody's training programs is the point of this policy. And then we have to train them that they are subject to monitoring on the classified network.
Hey, Lynn,
tells everybody. Yeah.
I got a question. So you said at the classification of the CD, is that the classification of the information encrypted, or are you just having to protect the key that encrypted it? So if you encrypt the data and it's encrypted on a CD, is the CD itself I'm trying to word this correctly. Is the CD itself protected at the classification of the encrypted data on the CD or from the, you know what I'm saying? I'm trying to word
I do. So, yeah, and we're off track on that, but I'm going to go with that for a minute because that's a great topic. So my cyber group has had this conversation many times. So when you create that CD, you create it on a classified system.
Correct.
So that CD is going to be secret. Even if you encrypt the data on it, you're still going to mark that CD as secret or the level of the system. And then the password, according to this policy, that this is the contractor version of what you would have as a DoD version. This policy says that password that de-encrypts that CD is secret as well.
Even if the information on the CD is unclassed or something like that?
Well, if you burn unclassed to a CD off of a classified network, I mean, if you didn't go through the forgotten terminology, the assured file transfer process, then it's still a secret CD.
Okay.
If you do go through that assured file transfer process, then you could get it down to an unclassed CD, but.
Which sometimes doesn't work as well as it probably should.
Yeah, and it's very limited on what applications you can use it on too. You can't use it on an Excel spreadsheet because there's no way to make that unclassified. But yeah, contractors are frequently battling this. The BitLocker. If you use BitLocker to encrypt your hard drives, your passcode for your BitLocker is got to be treated at the secret level because it unencrypts your hard drives. So same thing when you burn a CD.
Copy that.
No. All right. So still in the contractor version of your DoD guidance, it says, in addition to the training requirements outlined in the security manager portion of our manual, all IS authorized users will receive training on the security risks associated with their user activities. So again, role-based security. What's your role and are we training you for that role? And the contractor will determine the appropriate content. So even though they gave us a list of what had to be in there, now they're saying we also can add more information based on the roles of each individual on the classified network. Okay, so we're striking things off of our list of agenda here. So now we're going to talk about role-based security for a moment. So the NIST 853 control AT3 speaks specifically to role-based security training, and the organization provides role-based security training to personnel with assigned security roles and responsibilities before you let them on the network, when there's a change to their role, and annually. So the same way that it's required through our contractor guidance, the NISPOM, it's also required by AT3. So then our contract, again, the DCSA version, DAPM, I'll quit stuttering over that one sooner or later as I go through this. All IS users receive initial and annual training for general user training. So even if you're a privileged user, you still have to take the general user training. You can't just say, oh, I did the privileged user training, I'm good to go. The rule for us says all IS users have to do that general user. And if you're a privileged user, then you also do privileged user training. And then paragraph 4.3 also says if you're a data transfer agent, you have to do that training as well. And then for third-party personnel, we have to treat them as employees. Where that comes into play for DoD personnel is a lot of you could come to contractor locations and you can do work at contractor locations. You may be working with Northrop Grumman or Raytheon or Lockheed, and you're going to their facility and you're working on their network. Our guidance tells us we have to make sure that you're doing our security training so that you know what not to do on our networks. All right, so now we're going to talk about some of the requirements for the general user training that are required by the guidelines that, and these are all interpretations of 853 type of rules as well. So they all, well, you guys will have similar things that line up with this. So for general user training, the rules of behavior specify acceptable user actions to include explicit restrictions on the use of social networking sites, posting information on commercial websites, and sharing information system account information. And that's for the general user training for a classified network. So before you give them access to your classified network, you have to give them training on not posting stuff on social networking. And to me, it's not automatically intuitive that you would know to do that as a training person for a classified network. You wouldn't automatically think, oh, and I need to tell them, but it's in the rules saying that we have to. And then that cross-references to NIST 853 control called PL4, which is the rules of behavior training. And we're going to take a quick look at that. So PL4 requires you to train people for the rules of behavior, which establishes rules that describe the responsibilities, expected behavior with regard to the information and information system usage, that they receive a signed acknowledgement back from the individuals before you let them on the system. So you got to have a signature saying that they've done that training, and then that you update that training and have them review it at least annually.
Hey, Lynn, we have a question. Who determines and what is considered acceptable training?
Say the last part of that sentence again for me, Jesse.
What is considered acceptable training? Like who determines that and what that training is?
Yes, so that's kind of the point of this PowerPoint, is it lays out what those training requirements are, and you can do them by PowerPoint or you can do them in person.
But I think the question more is if someone was to put the training together, then who approves that training? Just any trainer could do that. I mean, anybody could just produce training. I mean, is there a particular way that gets approved?
So the person who's the equivalent of your security manager for that network. So for contractors, we use the acronym ISSM. So the ISSM is the one that would decide what's the right content. He's the one with the responsibility based on the guidelines.
Gotcha. Hopefully it answers the question.
Or if you're on an SCI network, it would be the ISSO. But
correct.
Yeah. All right, so we're still on PL4. PL4, the DCSA wrote a supplement to that. So because, I'm going to jump back one slide. So PL4 requires this training that you have to have rules of behavior training. But for DCSA, who writes our contractor, this is where your Air Force guidance may be different than DoD guidance. This is contractor guidance is different than the NIST 853. So the DCSA says the rules of behavior are part of your your annual security awareness training, signed and acknowledged via a user agreement. So when you sit down and you go over the user agreement, they're saying that's good enough. You don't have to have a separate briefing for that for contractors. But if you guys are doing system security plans and you're saying that you're meeting PL4, you have to make sure that you have some sort of rules of behavior training, or that the Air Force guidance gives you something like this that says your user account acknowledgement form is good enough training for those rules of behavior. I want to look at the bottom bullet on this. This is just interesting to me. Suspected misuse or compromise of a password shall be reported to the ISSM. Discovery of unauthorized use, possession, or download of a password cracking tool shall immediately be reported to the ISSM. This is your classified network. And they're saying that you have to tell people that if they find a password cracking tool on your classified network, they should report that. It's just interesting to me that they call that one out specifically. All right, so we covered the rules of behavior for general user training, and we're moving on. So the other things that are required on our training is that guidance on protecting physical area, media, and equipment, how the doors access works, how the alarms work, how to care for hard drives, where to lock them up at the end of the night. Those are all things that should be in your general user training to make sure the users understand them. Instructions on protecting authenticators, again, like we talked about on passwords. The processes for recognizing and reporting suspected security violations and incidents, classification and control marking compliance. That's how to mark your CDs when you burn them, what information go on the front. For contractors, if you guys didn't know, for contractors, there's supposed to be 8 specific items on a classified cover sheet or a classified item. Not the cover sheet, that's a bad terminology, but on the cover document, the front page of a classified document. And we're required to put those same items on a classified CD. So it's an overall classification, it's the date that the CD was burned, it's an unclassified title, it's our company name and address, so if it gets lost, somebody knows where to return it. It's the contract number that it applies to, it's the declassification date, it's the what it was derived from, a reference, whether it's security classification guide or another document, and the person who created the information. All of that's got to be on the front of the CD. And I've received CDs from the government that just have a big S on the front, which designates this as a secret CD. So there's a very big difference between our requirements for marking classified CDs, and I think you guys have the same requirements. They don't always get implemented, but that's part of our training, is we have to train people on the classification and control markings that go on those CDs when they're burned. Item H talks about incident response actions. We're supposed to train them on that. And then when there's 2-person integrity requirements, we train them on those as well. So the incident response actions correlates to another NIST 853 control, which is IR2. So we're going to jump over here real quick, and we're going to look at IR2. And it's pretty generic. It says the organization provides incident response training to information system users consistent with the assigned roles and responsibility, and you do that within 30 days of them assuming an incident response role. So if your classified system lost power, you need an incident response of what do you do to take care of that, or if the fire alarm goes off in your classified environment, what's your incident response for that? Whose role is it to make sure things are locked up? And you have to provide that training if they have a role. The DCSA put a supplement to that, and that's where you may find Air Force supplements to them as well. And their supplemental guidance says the incident recognition and reporting training shall be included as part of both the general and the privileged user awareness. The general users must be trained on what constitutes suspicious activity as it applies to the system, other users, and unauthorized individuals, internal and external to the organization. So you have to train those brand new people that just walk in the door and you're introducing them to a classified network. You also have to train them to say, but if you see something suspicious, you need to let us know. If you see somebody popping a thumb drive in that network, you need to let us know, and make sure they understand what is a suspicious activity and what's not. And the general users must also know to whom to report suspicious activity and to keep those discussions about potential incidents within the command and response chain.
The other thing I would say on the same line, Lynn, is the suspicious devices and random locations that doesn't seem to be right, always ask.
Right.
I've seen several pen testings where they've just put a device attached to a switch and just put here by, just an admin, and no one goes in there and verifies that this is an admin actually did put it there, and it's like a some type of network and scanning device. So just be aware of that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I had a role where my job was to inventory all the equipment in the classified server rooms. Mm-hmm. And I would go to the rack, and we used a barcode system, so every piece of equipment would have a barcode on it that you hit with a barcode scanner. But there would be equipment that didn't have a barcode on it. It was like, well, how did it get there? If it doesn't have a barcode on it, it didn't go through the authorized process. So you're right. They have to be able to acknowledge that and know who to talk to about it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So we touched on the general users, and general users are incident response. So now we're going to look at privileged user training, because the policies and procedures require different training for general users and privileged users. And again, this whole presentation is about the training packages. So again, the privileged user requirements require rules of behavior training. And it's the same rules of behavior training that we looked at for general users. And we have supplemental guidance that was put out by DCSA for us to follow, and it's the same information that we went through for general users. That if they find a cracking tool on the network, they have to notify the ISSM. So then, again, it goes down. It's the same requirements for general users, for privileged users as general users, and you get to the incident response. And I'm going here for a reason, because I want you guys to see the supplemental that we have on the contractor side. So we're now at the DCSA Supplemental Training for Incident Response for Privileged Users. And this, I think, is interesting. Privileged users should be trained in preserving the scene, preserving the data, volatile and non-volatile, chain of custody and reporting requirements. Privileged users frequently move from containment phase into eradication, compromising data necessary in prosecuting a potential criminal case. So somebody comes to you and says, hey, the system's acting odd, and you're like, oh, well, I'll re-image the drive on it, we'll get it back up and running, we'll move on. This requirement requires us to train our privileged users not only to recognize that may be a security incident that they're seeing, but how not to damage the evidence trail. They don't have to know how to do forensics. They have to know how not to screw up the forensics. And it's difficult to find somebody who can do that training, who can say, I'm not going to make you a forensic expert, but I'm going to show you how not to contaminate the forensics so that if we call an expert in, they can fix it. Because like I said, it is very much the case that your system administrator's first response is going to be, yep, we'll re-image it and get it back up and running. And that wipes out all of the forensic evidence in the process. So there is a requirement for those privileged users to be trained in how not to mess up forensics. All right, now we talk about data transfer agents, because there are controls that require them to be trained differently. Jesse, do you guys use the term data transfer agent?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, some of us who've been deployed have used it, and like I said earlier, it sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. It's interesting.
Yeah. So trusted download is the old terminology, and if you did trusted downloads, they're now assured file transfers. But the person who's allowed to do an assured file transfer is called the data transfer agent on the contractor side of the world. So we have to train them on how to do those trusted downloads. So the data transfer agent is performing a security relevant function in providing an endpoint security during a data transfer. So they're the ones verifying. If you're trying to pull an unclassed file, back that up and do it the other way around. If you're pulling a secret file off of a secret network and burning it to a CD, that's a data transfer. It's a simple secret to secret, high to high type of transfer. And the data transfer agents are supposed to do those, and that takes that workload off of the ISSO and ISSM, so they don't have to be always standing by waiting to burn a disk when the program needs to burn a disk. You can train people on the program to do that. They become privileged users in the process, but that's who we're talking about here. So they have to be trained to do data review and sanitization and what tools you use for that. They have to be trained on the security classification guide so they know what data is secret, what data is not secret. The permissible assured file transfer file formats, like I said, you're not allowed to do an assured file transfer on a spreadsheet. So and the assured file transfer is like Jesse asked earlier, when you're taking an unclassified file off of a classified network and trying to create an unclassified CD. That's where you have to use the tools to review the data to make sure nothing got moved with that unclassified file so that there's nothing hiding in the background of it. And spreadsheets, you just can't do that. You can hide an entire game in a single cell of a spreadsheet. So there's just too much data in there to review. And then what authorized formats they're allowed to use for those transfers and how to mark the disk when they're done. And then what logs they fill out. So that's the training you need to go through for those data transfer agents. All right, so we're going to look at other user training real quick. AC18 talks about wireless access. For that control, DCSA wrote a supplement for us, so you may have the equivalent like an Air Force Supplemental Guidance for that. It says this control applies even if no wireless is authorized in the facility. For example, wireless is prohibited and implementation guidance should include that users are reminded during initial and annual training that wireless and wireless devices are prohibited. So for the training on your classified network, you have to train on wireless devices to make sure people understand that there's no wireless allowed on your classified network. And that's NIST 853 control AC18, so that would apply to everybody's networks. Control AT3, subcontrol 4, suspicious communication and system behavior. The organization provides training to its personnel on indicators of malicious code in order to recognize suspicious communications, anomalous behavior in organizational information systems. So on your unclassed networks, you guys probably get training that says that how to recognize a spam email or how to recognize a phishing email. This control requires you to do something similar on your classified network, that your users of the classified network are trained to see what malicious code would look like on the classified side, which is not where people look for it. You don't look for spam emails on the classified network usually. All right, we're almost done with our full list of things. So now insider threat. Insider threat is a huge program for contractors that is continually growing on how we implement insider threat, and whether we're monitoring our unclassified networks to see who's taking data off of those or to see who's accessing those in the middle of the night. This guidance all talks about your classified network and what you're doing on your classified network for insider threat. So our contractor overarching classification guidance says that indicators of insider threat behavior and procedures are reported. Let me try that again. That we're training people on what those indicators are and who to report them to. And that cross-references to NIST 853 control AT2 subcontrol 2, and I'm going to go take a look at that. It's really short control that says the organization includes security awareness training on recognizing and reporting potential indicators of insider threat. So there is a control that requires you to do that training on your classified side for your classified users. You may be able to use the same training you're doing on the unclassed network to say, yep, they did their annual training, so they've met the requirement on the classified side. But it allows you to, you need to know that there is a control for it, and you can check that control off by saying, yes, our members do that insider threat training. Control PM12 also talks about the insider threat program, and it says the organization implements an insider threat program that includes cross-discipline insider threat incident training, or incident handling team. So a cross-discipline would be not only your physical security people, but also your cyber security people, that they're working together. So not only are you looking to see who's burning CDs on your classified network, but you're also checking backpacks on the way out the door to make sure that nobody's carrying classified CDs out in their backpack as they go out the door. And then DCSA put a supplement to that that says the organization is required to comply with the requirements of the NIST Insider Threat Program. So it's kind of a circular requirement, because that then points you back up to AT2, which says you have an insider threat training. So, all right, I want to talk real quick about spillage and contingency training. Control IR9, subcontrol 2, information spillage response training. The organization provides information spillage response training annually. That's the whole control. It's hard to find somebody for contractors. It's hard to find somebody to teach that training of what do you do when you have a data spill. Because data spills can happen on your classified system. You can end up with top secret on a secret network, and then you have a spill that you have to clean up. But where it usually happens is it happens on your unclassified network. You get somebody who accidentally puts a secret statement into an unclassified email, and now you have to clean up your unclassified network. And so training people on spillage cleanup is complicated based on your unclassed network, and you work in the classified environment, but you now have a requirement to train people who work in an unclassified requirement on response to data spills. So there's a lot of room for interpretation on how many of them you have to train or who you have to train. So it's something to look at to make sure you're implementing that control and meeting the requirements of that control. So control CP3 talks about contingency training, and it's not incident response training. So it's a different contingency plan. So maybe it's the idea of your classified server room is relocating, or you have a backup server room. How do you switch from your current, your primary operation site to your contingency site? So you're required to provide training on that. The organization provides contingency training to information system users consistent with the assigned roles and their responsibilities. So if they're not assigned to be part of that incident response transition team, then you don't have to provide the training to them. But if they do, you have to give them that training within 60 days of them getting the role, and then anytime their role changes, and then again annually on top of that. Physical security and KVM switches, we'll cover those real quick. Control AT3 subparagraph 2, subcontrol 2 is physical security controls. The organization provides security personnel with initial and annual training on the employment and operation of physical security controls. That's your alarm system. That's your access control system. It's making sure that if you're the last user of the day going out the door, you know how to set the alarms. So you have to meet that to be able to check that control off in your system security plan. You have to make sure that you're doing that training. PE5 requires access control for output devices. I didn't put the specific wording, but it's about keyboard, video, mouse, and switch usage. DCSA focuses down to that. And it's a huge supplement for them. That A through K, I skipped all of those guidelines, and I just went to guideline L, which says the ISSM and ISSO and supervisors shall ensure user training and compliance to the requirements associated with the introduction and use of multi-position switches. So KVM switches add a lot of risk to your network, and you have to be training your users on specifically how to use those KVM switches or how not to make the mistake of switching to the N-class network when they thought they were on the secret network. And that's part of that PE5 control, is to make sure that people are getting that training. All right, so we're going to talk about performance measures real quick. So control AT1, your -1 controls are all policies and procedures. So AT1 is a security awareness training policy and procedure. So you got to have a policy and procedure, and that procedure will stipulate that the organization develop and documents and disseminates a security awareness and training policy that addresses the purpose, scope, and rules and responsibilities. So it's going to talk about everything we've talked about in the presentation, that policy and procedure for your classified network talks about what your training program is and what different training presentations people are going to have to take, that they're going to have to take general user training, privileged user training, data transfer agent training, contingency training. It's all got to be in that policy and procedure. That it facilitates and the implementation of a security awareness and training policy, reviews and update, you review it and update it. Let me try that again. That the policy reviews and updates the current security awareness training policy annually. Haven't had enough coffee. The security awareness training procedures at least annually as well. Okay, PM6, we haven't touched on that one earlier. So PM6 requires information systems measurement of performance. The organization develops, monitors, and reports on the results of information security measures of performance. The supplement that DCSA gives to contractors is that, as stated in the NIST 855, performance measurement guide for information security security measures monitor the number of employees who receive annual training, the percent of information systems with ATOs, the number of privileged users, the number of low and high risk data transfer agents, and other measurements as required by the AO. So not only do you have to do training, you have to keep statistics on your training to say how many people took it, whether they were standard users, whether they were privileged users. And PM14 talks about testing and training and monitoring. The organization implements a process to ensure that the organization's plans for conducting training are developed and maintained. So after you write the policy that says you're going to have a training program, you write the procedures that say here's the training that we're going to do for each person. After you keep statistics on them, you still have to have a control that says you're going to ensure that you do all of that. That you didn't just write it all down. You went ahead and did it all as well. So for contractors, I always use this one as a sales pitch for my organization. But PM15 says that you should be a member of organizations that help you with security. And specifically, it says the organization established and institutionalizes contact with selected groups and associations within the security community to facilitate ongoing security education and training for organizational personnel, to maintain currency and recommended security practices, techniques, and technologies, and to share current security-related information, including threats, vulnerabilities, and incidents. So I know a lot of you have a Security Plus certification, so you're probably working to get your continuing education credits to keep those current, and that would help you check the checkbox for PM15 to say, yes, we're meeting that control because we belong to these organizations and we work with these organizations work to keep us informed of current threats. And I think that was my last slide. So in summary, we've covered all the different training packages that you need to have to meet the RMF requirements. We talked about that the ISM is the trainer, that you have to have records of your training, that the records have to include not only the person's name, but the date and the type of training, that they have to be kept for 5 years, that the training policy is distributed to the users so they know what training they're responsible to do, that you have statistics on the training to show what's been done, you have a plan and you're monitoring the plan, and that people need to join security organizations so that you can check the PM15 as well, PM5 on that. And that completes my presentation.
Cool. Thank you very much. A lot of information to take in from this 800-53. As is posted in the channel, during my bachelor's, we dealt a lot with the NIST documents, specifically that one, but quite a bit of them. So, I have not seen any questions from the chat. So unless you have any further comments, thank you very much for your presentation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Take care.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.